What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Your Superior Self. Today, I am joined with Philip McKernan. I'm very excited to have him on the show. I saw him on my brother-in-law, Joe McClinsky's. Actually heard him on the podcast, Shift Happens. Check out that episode. But Philip, I want to say thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, and likewise, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So I know you're big into this One Last Talk. That is the title of your book. That's the kind of the speaking gig that you have going around the different cities. Let's treat this podcast as like the last podcast, right? So I'm going to ask you questions and feel free to dive deep and be transparent with your answers. And we already discussed this offline, but if this was like the last podcast that somebody's listening to, like I want them to walk away from this feeling inspired and motivated to make change in their lives. So with that theme, go ahead and talk to us about what you're up to today.
Well, I suppose as you mentioned, One Last Talk is a big part of my life at the moment. And basically, I wanted to create an environment whereby we create a little bit of urgency and we have conversations today rather than waiting to have them in 20 years from now. The second thing I wanted to do is create an experience, a live experience that anybody can speak at. It's not just for the gurus, and it's not just for the speakers, it's not just for the book writers, it's not for who you perceive to be successful, it's for everybody. Because I believe everybody not just has a story, but everybody has a truth that has value to themselves if they share it and speak it, and also has an opportunity to shift humanity. And then finally, I wanted to create an environment where there's a two-way dialogue. I'm sick and tired of going to conferences where somebody stands on stage and either implies or tells you how you should live your life. And you walk away from there kind of inspired, but then there's another part of us that very few people, if anybody's talking about, and that is when you walk away from a lot of conferences, deep down you feel inadequate. You actually feel like you're not as good as them, or you're not, living up to the expectations of yourself or as So I wanted to shift that dialogue and create a safe environment for people to stand up, share their truth, and free themselves and humanity from as a result of that.
That's awesome. I really love that. What sparked it? Like, what inspired you to be conscious about the One Last Talk, to not die with the music inside of you?
I think if you do something that impacts the world and you do something that is aligned to who you are, I think the origin of that is always in your own story. So for me personally, I wasn't heard. I didn't feel heard. I didn't feel seen, or I didn't feel important. I didn't feel adequate in the world. And in some ways, I want to write that for people who maybe are sitting somewhere who don't believe they have a story worth sharing. And I want to basically challenge them in that regard and show them that when they share their truth, when they share their narrative, without the need of looking good doing it, that actually the world will conspire to see them and accept them in a different way. So in many respects, it's kind of, if you look at my origin story, it has influenced where I've come to in the work that I do today.
What was the exact moment? Like, was there something that happened to you that you needed to get your story out? Like, what was the moment where you were like, I need to start speaking more passionately or being brutally honest with my story?
Well, I think there's two parts to this. There's one where One Last Talk is really about the speakers, the men and women who have shared their One Last Talk and are going to. And I was obsessed by the idea of creating a platform and searching for that. And there was a specific moment where I asked a group of people to speak. And I said, listen, it was originally called The Real Summit. And I want you to come to The Real Summit with something that the world has never heard from you before in 15 minutes or less. And one of the women said, but I don't know where to start. And I just looked and I just said, imagine it's your one last talk. And she goes, whoa. And she didn't say now I know. She just said, now I know where to go with this. And then I used the One Last Talk comment again with another speaker. And they just went, wow, that's profound, or that's challenging, or whatever. And finally, I realized that was the thing that was stirring people, because when you tell somebody about One Last Talk, it's almost impossible not to go to that place of imagining, or even beginning to imagine, what yours would be. And I went on to GoDaddy, search One Last Talk, and there it was for the ripe old price of $8.99, the domain, and I bought it, and here we are since. The moment for me when I began to show up in the world, I did a best man speech in Ireland many, many, many years ago in a place called Lucan, just outside of the outskirts of Dublin in Ireland, and for my best friend Jeff. And I remember standing on a stage, which I didn't want to be on. I wanted to hide from the world. I mean, I was inadequate. I was, dyslexic. I couldn't read and write. I had all sorts of, chips on my shoulder. I was angry. I was sad. I was whatever. And I remember leading up to that talk thinking, why don't I try to be funny? And then my insecurity spoke loudly. And I said, well, why don't I try and be smart? Why don't I try and come across as smart? And what I ended up doing, I was so exhausted. I just said, screw it all. And I ended up standing on that stage and speaking my truth. And I ended up getting a standing ovation. And that was the first time in my life I'd been seen and recognized, even though that day was not about me and it shouldn't have been about me. And I came off that stage and a stranger came up with tears pouring down his eyes or his face and said, if I ever get married, will you be my best man? And of course, as Irish people have a tendency to say, as I looked at him, I said, will you ever go F off? And he says to me, you've got a gift. And it was in that moment, sometimes a stranger can see something in you that you cannot or are unwilling to see in yourself. And that did open me a little bit, just a little bit to begin with.
Mm. What is your truth?
Mine or the world's?
Yours.
Well, my truth is, my story is I'm Irish. My name is Philip McKernan. I went to this school and I do what I do right now. My truth can be something very, very different. The truth of my life is the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think what we talk a lot about is our own personal stories and our narratives. We tend to highlight our successes, but we tend not to talk about our failures. And the truths are typically the things that we don't share publicly. So, for example, one truth that for me that a lot of people either don't know or don't want to know is that I struggle deeply as a father. And people keep telling me how an amazing father I am. They post it on Facebook all the time, and they cite me as an inspiration. And yet, when I look at myself as a father, as it relates to my children, I don't consider myself a failure. I just consider myself deeply flawed in that space, and something that I'm working very hard on. So that's one part of my truth. The other thing is I'm an insecure individual who, worries about and worries about stuff like everyone else. I wonder some days I wake up and I wonder what I'm doing, and I wonder, have I got the right to do this? That's all part of my truth, but that's not the thing that I should be speaking about, because when you're a speaker, when you're a writer, when you're a coach, when you run events all over the world and you attract, in some cases, very successful people, and in some cases, everyday individuals who are trying to be successful, whatever that means to them, there's an expectation that you're meant to share all the good shit on Facebook and pretend you're happy on Facebook every single day. The truth is that I'm human and therefore I'm flawed.
Two great topics that I want to talk about is fatherhood and then permission to be successful. I feel like it isn't until now that we've given, as a society, given ourselves permission to be successful. We've never really, I know I haven't had this mentor of guiding me along life's journey and helping me along the way to be successful. I didn't know really what success was. Well, maybe I did. Maybe it was like this idea of wealth, idea of cars, big house. But then it wasn't, that was like my target. That was the end of my map. That was what success was. But now it's like society, well, maybe not society, but maybe the people that I'm hanging out with is really giving me permission to look outside of that and really try to find it. And I know some of your story growing up in Ireland, where you were you're Catholic, very traditional. No one really pointed you in the direction that you needed to go. I knew you were kind of looking for someone to say, hey, look, good job. This is where you need to go next. Like, explain that. Like, why is it that we need, as a person, like, why do we need someone to say, hey, good job, but you need to do this better. Good job. This is where you need to go next. Good job. You need to get better at this.
Because we're too busy beating the shit out of ourselves and judging ourselves to hell and back, and therefore we don't give ourselves permission, and therefore we desperately seek permission from others. That's number one. Number two is most of our lives are driven, and people don't agree with this, and people will argue this, but if you're honest enough with yourself and you get to the core of who you are, you will realize that there's so much truth in what I'm about to say, and that is most of us are living our lives for somebody else. We're trying to still live up to the expectations of a loved one, a family, a father in particular, our mother, and we're still trying to prove them right, or we're still trying to prove them wrong. So either way, that can drive you to achieve success, monetary success, but it will never bring you happiness. It will never bring you fulfillment. And I've worked with some of the most successful sports people on this earth and business people on this earth, and they in some cases, have achieved what they've achieved because they were dying to prove to their father that they're good enough, dying to prove to their mother that they were wrong. It's the same energy, and neither will give you fulfillment. It will give you enormous success potentially, because that running from, say, poverty can often create massive amount of wealth if it's deep enough in you and you've got that drive. But it doesn't mean you're making money doing something you love. And there's an enormous difference. And I think we've got this warped perspective of what success is. And very few of us understand what success is. And the reason for that is we don't understand who we are. Therefore, we have no idea what will make us successful or feel fulfilled. And I think a lot of us, therefore, create intellectual goals of the things we think we want to achieve and the things that we think will make us happy. And 99% of the time, we get to the top of that mountain having achieved X, Y, or Z. It could be a company, it could be a car, it could be a pension, it could be a paycheck, a rise, a promotion. And we get to the top of that mountain and we just look around. And if we're quiet enough just for a minute, we'll say to ourselves, typically we'll go, shit, I thought it would feel different. I thought I would stand on this mountain being a representation for an achievement in life, and I would feel different or better or more at peace. And what we don't do is we don't stop to consider what is the step we missed in that process. We're too busy looking for the next peak, the next mountain, and then the cycle continues. And I pick up the pieces historically with people who have spent way too much time pursuing and not enough time being, and they come to me and they say, listen, finally I realize there's something wrong. So my job is to try and get those people earlier in the cycle. And even if someone comes and spends some time with me and walks away and says, yeah, that guy's full of shit, I'm actually on the perfect path. Everything's awesome. I'm amazing. My family are amazing. My relationships are amazing. I'm doing exactly what I'm meant to do on this earth. Brilliant. Well, then now you know. But too many people avoid my work because they're afraid of looking at themselves and they're afraid of facing the truth. And because they know deep down they're out of alignment, they're living in the wrong house, living with the wrong person, doing the wrong work, having a disconnected relationship with self, and they justify to themselves that they don't need to address that today because when they achieve the monetary success, then they'll have the freedom to go and do whatever that is. It doesn't work like that because you're betraying and cheating on yourself every single day. So energetically and spiritually, the universe doesn't present it to you on a plate in 10 years when you're finally financially free. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, but I mean, like the idea, like deep down that maybe you're not living with the right person or you're doing the right job or following your dreams in life. Everybody has that feeling, right? But like you said, that permission, how do you give yourself permission?
I think one of the biggest missing steps for a lot of people is getting in touch with what if nothing changes. So people will say to me all the time, okay, I don't like my job. Great. Now, what should I do? And I'll go, well, nothing, because I don't feel any urgency from you. So what do you mean you don't like your job? Well, it's fine. Like, I don't hate it and I don't love it. Right? How many times have you heard that? How many times have you even thought about that in the context of your own life? Because I know I have. Well, you're standing on the fence and there is no urgency at all to make a decision. And it's not until you get into the darkness, which will eventually catch up with you, and it will manifest itself in a physical, emotional, or mental context. Always. It has to come out of you. When you understand how disconnected you really are, the cost associated with that for you and everyone else that lives around you. I'll give you a quick example of this. I'm in a conference, 500 people. I go one-to-one in the audience, which I love to do when I speak. People call it dangerous in the sense that you don't know what you're going to get, but that's me. I go to this man and he goes, okay, fine. I'm in an industry and I've been there for a while and I don't like my job, but I don't know what to do next. Now, where would you go with that? And I said, I don't see any urgency. I don't see any need. I don't see any real desire. And he goes, well, one, you don't know me. And number two is I disagree with you. 500 people watching me and I'm about to be either, proven wrong or whatever. And I'm okay with that. And I said, he said, well, I disagree with you. And I said, well, I'll prove it to you. I said, how long have you been in this job that you hate and that you want to leave? And under his breath, he muttered a number and I couldn't hear him. And I said, excuse me? And he said, 14 years. And the reason that he was staying in this job that is not fulfilling him in any way capacity was a lack of clarity about what's next. Number 2 is the paycheck. Number 3 is the rationalization and justification and the story he tells himself that the money he makes doing something he doesn't love allows him and affords him a lifestyle where his kids can go to a nice school and this and this and this and this. And I said, okay, so here's the deal. If one of your children came to you and told you exactly what you're telling me in 20 years from now, what would you say? And without missing a beat, he goes, oh, Jesus, I'd be like, leave. Don't do something you don't want to do. Don't stay in a job that doesn't inspire you and move you and everything else. In other words, we can see that for other people, but we don't give ourselves permission. And it comes down to a self-value thing as far as I'm concerned. But the bigger thing for him is he did not realize the cost. And what he's doing is, and what I said to him finally was, that conversation with your son or your daughter is going to be a lecture. In other words, because you don't do anything about it, you're going to be lecturing your son in 20 years, and he's going to be rolling his eyes internally or externally. But if you begin to take chances in your life, you'll bring your son and your daughter up to feel inspired and to feel worthy and to make sure that they put a benchmark in their life and say, I will never settle because I know my dad didn't and I witnessed that my whole life. So we give other people permission, but we find it very hard to give ourselves permission. And back to the judgment, it's how we hold ourselves in this world. Most people don't like who they are. Most people don't like, and I don't care if anyone disagrees with that. I really don't, because I've worked with so many thousands of people. And when they're honest and when you get into the core, most people don't have a very good opinion of themselves. They do intellectually. They'll tell themselves they might do, but they don't feel emotionally good about themselves. And therefore, why would you give yourself permission to be happier? Because you don't fucking deserve it. I know that sounds very simple, but that's the core.
I love that. Was there like a time in your life, like where you found yourself working in a 9-to-5 that you hated? Was there an example, a particular chapter in your life where this evolved into fruition for you? Like, is there, like, were you working a 9-to-5? Were you doing something similar where you were like, I can't stand doing this anymore. I need to do something that I'm passionate about?
I was in a worse place than that.
Really?
I was in a worse place than that. I was in a place that I didn't hate and I didn't love. And to me, that's the worst place to be in, because that's the sort of position that you stay in for the long term. So hate, no. I mean, I think I had a job when I was much younger that I absolutely detested and hated. I spent every day in school for like, up to 17 years old, detesting school every single day, like absolutely hating it. It's the same principle. So what we're doing with our children, by the way, if we put them in the schooling system, depending on the schools they go to, depending on the system, depends on, their makeup in terms of whether they like education and like going to, but if most kids today, certainly when I was going to school, hated school. But basically by sending them to school every single day, we're basically saying that it's okay to go and spend 6 or 7 hours a day in an institution. For some people, it's like a prison. For me, it was like a prison, and hate it, but that's acceptable. And what ends up happening is we wonder why we come out of school, we go to college and do something that we may or may not love, and we use that as a reason or a way to get into a job that we may or may not love, and we spend 7 or 8 hours a day, 4 or 5, 6 days a week doing something we don't. We're what's the word? We're basically implying to our children from a very early age that this is acceptable, that this is almost expected. So I worked in jobs where I didn't like it, but it was that more painful position where I didn't hate it and I didn't love it. And I just stayed for up to when I was 37, 38 years old. I finally started to make the changes I needed to make to try to find meaning in this world. And it was not easy to make that transition. I'm not sitting here saying, hey, just go ahead and find what you love. It's not that easy. But when I look back, it's worth it.
What was hard about it? Like, was it, your parents? Was it your spouse? Was it the kids? What made it hard for you?
Everything. I mean, I think for me is I had to shake my identity. So it challenged my identity to the core of who I thought I was and who I was told I was. Number one. Number two is when you start, many of us are surrounded by families. Most of us are surrounded by families who want us to be happy, but many of us are surrounded by families who want us to be happy. They just don't want us to change. So in order to do what you want to do, it requires you to change. And therefore the people around you, the people that say they want you to be happy more than anyone in the world, often resist the very change that you need to make in order to show up as you in the world today. So what happens is you have to almost redefine your relationship with everybody around you. You have to step into the unknown, which is scary. You have to let go of the intellectual skills that define who you are in terms of success and start to rely on that more intuitive spiritual place that all of us have within us. And you have to take risks, and you have to be willing to fall on your face. And also, I believe that when you step out and find something that brings you joy, there's a degree of loneliness with that in that interim period when you're trying to find your way and you're turning down your job that pays you well and everyone's judging you and everyone's saying, are you crazy? What is wrong with you? And all of that stuff. And that's the thing that's almost like the rite of passage to some extent. There has to be some degree of sacrifice and pain for you to realize how lucky you are and how privileged you are to get to the other side. And it's available to absolutely everybody. And one of the big things that I hear from people is that they go, oh, well, it was easy for you. You had money. And people make this assumption all the time. I was interviewing a podcast last week and a guy made an assumption. He says, well, you had money. No, I didn't. When I made the transition to do what I really wanted to do, I had $200 in the bank account and I had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt because of the meltdown. We had a few pieces of property that were just a disaster. And I actually made the move in the worst possible time, in the greatest recession that maybe you and I will ever see in our lives. And I made the move to do what I do now.
Mm. What were some of the methods that helped you along the way? Was there any type of self-bettering methods that you used, journaling, meditation, running, exercise, that helped you grow as an individual during that transition?
Yes and no. No, as in not one of those things I did consciously in order to help me as a tool, as a ritual. I don't have those morning rituals. I get asked about a lot. But yes, I would say that there is a direct correlation between some type of fitness and physical fitness, looking after yourself, and the results that I was achieving. The challenge I find with a lot of people is they try to, I saw an article recently about, what do famous people eat for breakfast? And it talked about Richard Branson's muesli and whatever. And the article didn't say it, but it implied that if you eat this muesli, you're going to have the same results. I think it's almost bordering on ludicrous. So modeling is one of these things that I get why everyone is obsessed about modeling, but it is incredibly dangerous because when you start to model pieces of everybody else and you take the pieces of them that you want to emulate and succeed, it's not long before you look in the mirror, if you're lucky to find yourself and aware enough to do that, and you look in the mirror and say, well, okay, where am I in all of this? Where have I gone in all of this? Where have I disappeared in all this? So I think we're modeling ourselves too much on the success of other people. Be inspired here and there, but just be careful with modeling, because it is imperative. The more you understand who you are, the clearer it becomes who you are in this world and how you therefore need to show up in this world. And it's the missing step for 99% of the population. Most people don't see the value in taking a week out and working and figuring out who they are at the core. What has made you who you are? What are the patterns that drive you, whether you're conscious of them or not? How has your past created your present, and therefore your present is influencing your future? And everybody that I do that work with walks away going, it's not a case of I need to find my passion. I now know who I am, and therefore I'm much clearer on who I need to be. And it's less about this frenetic energy of trying to find.
Mm. Yeah, I agree 100%, because I feel like my entire life I have been probably more than some, but a type of a follower. In high school, I would follow the cool kids. I was a jock. Sports. In college, I kind of went with the majors that were made the most money. I listened to the music that was most popular. I would do the things that society deemed as acceptable. And now I'm really into this realm of who am I? Who is Trey? And it's really hard for me because I don't really know, right? Like I know what I feel. I know what interests me. I'm starting to learn that anyway. I'm learning a lot about philosophy and learning the meaning of life. Well, if there is a meaning, but I'm starting to dive into that. And a quote that really stuck out to me that you said is, if you do not bring forth what is it that is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And that really impacted me because it was like, I need to find this burning sensation, whatever it is that I want to create, whatever my meaning is. I need to bring it to the world. I need to bring it to myself. I need to know who this is, who Trey really is, because if I don't, it will destroy me because I will never know.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. Number one is I really appreciate your honesty. Number two is that quote I published recently, but that quote is from the Bible. And I'm not a religious person at all, but I don't remember. And I first heard that from a gentleman called Yannick Silver, who you and I may even know. I'm not sure, but he's a friend of Joe's, your brother-in-law. And I really appreciate your honesty about, not knowing who you really are, because when you've got a microphone in front of you and you've got a podcast or you've got a book or you're a speaker or you're any type of public facing figure, there's this tendency to, not share either your truth or just by not sharing it. And this expectation that, you need to have it all figured out. But I was at a retreat once with a group of clients, and I asked them on day one, I just said, as best you can, just maybe give me a sense of why you're here, and give us a sense why you're here. And the very first lady, who's just the most beautiful soul, she said, you know what? I know why I'm here. I'm here because I've lost myself in the business. Herself and her husband own a business. And I've lost myself as a mother in my two kids. And I want to get back to who I am. Now, that sounds very either logical or makes some sort of degree of sense. And the question I asked for, I said, did you ever know who you were? Really? And she looked at me and she's with sadness in her face, and she started to tear up, and she said, no, not a chance. I've never taken the time. I've never taken the space. I've never asked the right questions. I've never done the exploratory work to understand who I am at the core. And therefore, she didn't know how she was in relationship to all these other things. And therefore, she doesn't understand what her identity is. And therefore, she latches onto the business, latches onto the children. But the reality of business and children, they either go away, they move away, or they change and they don't need you as much. And what ends up happening is with the US military, whether it's football players, soccer players, golfers, mums, dads, entrepreneurs, workers, how many people retire and die in a ridiculously short space of time because whatever they've been doing suddenly dries up, and that has been their identity. So for her, the work was to begin to uncover who she really was, as opposed to what she's been told she is or was in her life. And that was the beginning of an incredible journey for her.
Like, what are some methods that people can use to help find who they are? Like, is there anything that you suggest to your clients?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's about, I'm not here to, my job is here to try and offer some context rather than, sell, my programs or what I do. But when I bring people away, so for example, there's a week away I do in Ireland every year. It's called Brave Soul. And we go to Ireland and we spend 7 days. And basically what we do is we go back into your past. And people go, oh, that's scary. So, hang on, so we haven't even gone there yet and you're telling me it's scary. Why is it scary? And all the things I don't want to acknowledge and the things I don't want to remember. And I said, well, good luck with that, because you're already renouncing a part of who you are and therefore wondering why you're not complete in this world. You're already hiding from parts of who you are. So I was saying that the past has created the present and the present is creating the future. So in other words, everything you are today, everything you do today, every decision you make or indecision you make is influenced or driven directly by who you are. In other words, where you grew up, how you grew up, the people you grew up around, your parents, the school, the neighborhood, your friends, your lack of friends, everything. And that has designed who you are today. And therefore, who you are today is making decisions about the future that is going to change the trajectory of your life. If you want to understand who you are, it is definitely not a vision board of the future. It is definitely not living in the now. People say, well, I want to just live in the now. So, well, good luck with that. But if your now is shit, why do you want to live in it? I want to change my now if it's not working. But I tell you, the place that I learned the most about myself is when I went back into my past. When I went back into my past, I thought it was the most futile, stupid waste of time. Why linger on the past? Why go back and overturn those rocks that were painful or whatever? And I went back and I realized, number one is how much of a victim I was in the world. Number two is how much anger I had in the world, even though I didn't consider myself an angry person. 3, how sad I was in the world. 4 is I realized how much trauma I had gone through as a kid, even though I would have sat there and went, no, I didn't suffer a whole lot of trauma. My friend John did, and Sarah and my other buddy did, but not me. And I started to build this picture, and then it started to be absolutely blatantly obvious why there was a lack of success, a lack of momentum in my life, a lack of congruency, a lack of alignment. I knew then why I wasn't doing the work I was meant to do in this world. I knew I didn't like myself when I came out of that work. Now, that might sound very heavy, and that might sound negative, but now I can do something with that. That was the greatest body of work. So when we go to Brave Soul, we do that body of work at the front end of the week. Then we look at your current reality and we create a bridge. And people are sitting there, and I'm not shitting you, going, oh my God, I never realized I do this because of that. Now I understand it, not just intellectually, but emotionally. We're walking around this earth trying to understand everything up here. And we're lost in our heads. We're reading the book, saying, oh, no, I know that. I read the book. I go, great. But have you integrated it into your life? How do you feel about that? And when they do that, then they can start imagining to what's possible in their lives, imagining what their gift is, not their talent, imagining how they can show up and impact the world, whether it's their family, themselves, their community, the world. And they can start to create a vision that is in alignment with who they are. And they can begin to change the narrative, being fully aware of the past, how it has affected the present, and really start to shift the narrative to change the future. But there's too many of us are forward focused, are trying to live in the now, and we haven't experienced the past, and therefore we have no idea who we are.
Yeah, I mean, I've read this book called The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer, and he talks about feeling, the pain, the past, dealing with it, filtering it through your heart. I think a lot of people don't want to recognize the past and experiences because they don't want to feel the pain.
Exactly.
And you have said numerous times that pain is a great teacher. And I don't think people realize that you have to feel it to get through it. Like, you can't just keep putting it on the back burner and expecting to go through life and getting past it. It never really goes away, right?
It never goes away, but here's the opportunity. The opportunity is to begin to experience it, relive it to some extent in a safe environment, and then begin to accept it. And that is the only time it starts to dissolve itself. By putting it, I'll give you an example. And I don't want to frighten people away from one last talk, because this is an example. And for some, it might be an extreme example. I don't. I think it's a life example. There was a lady called Lena who came to Boulder to witness one last talk, sat in the audience. And a lady called Neely stood in the audience and shared a time earlier in her life when she was sexually abused. And that was part of her truth that she had never shared publicly before, and was, I tell you, had no plans to share it publicly, and was shocked that she was sharing it, on stage in front of 150 people. And I think is also subsequently shocked of how it freed her. But Lena's sitting in the audience, and up to this point, this beautiful lady had been developing white spots on her skin, all over her chest, all over her back, and no specialist could get to the bottom of it. They couldn't figure out what was going on. And in that moment, when Neely shared her story, she felt this anxiety rush through her body of this story that she tried to bury. Notice I say tried to bury. And she named it and acknowledged it for the first time. And the white spots started to dissipate in her skin, until she stood on that stage, the same stage in a different city, and shared her story for the first time ever. Her brother was in the room, her friends were in the room, and she shared that truth. And she did not realize that despite the fact that she's so smart, that intellectually her brain had basically said, we're going to protect you from this, so we're going to bury it so far down. She realized in that moment when she shared it that actually a lot of her life had been controlled by the very thing she was trying to suppress. So the idea of pain is that we don't want to relive it, but by trying to pretend it doesn't exist and trying to move away from it, it doesn't help. But it's about naming it, integrating it into our lives, and then it starts to dissolve. And it's what I say, it starts to loosen its grip on us. So stop trying to get rid of pain and fear and start to accept it. And then it doesn't control you anymore. And that sounds easy, but I don't think we can do that on our own.
No, I think a lot of it is, and I've experienced this too, is like trying to live a little bit more transparent and be honest with people, even if I know it's going to anger them. But it's also the fear of not being forgiven, right? Like if you go and have that hard talk with your father or mother or wife or whomever you need to have that hard talk with, it's kind of like the fear that, like, I don't know if they're, I can be transparent with them, maybe voice some of the wrongs that I've done in my life, but I'm afraid that they're just not going to forgive me.
Well, you don't really need to be afraid of that because, most 99% of the people, if not 100% of the people walking this earth haven't forgiven themselves. So you just add one more to the pile. It's not that big a deal, really. I think what people are afraid of is they won't be seen and they won't be accepted and they won't be loved. And I think that's why they call speaking the greatest fear in the world. And that's why I disagree immensely. it's not the speaking, it's the act of speaking and what it represents. And to me, I think what we're deeply afraid of is not being fully loved and being accepted. And the irony of all of this is that in order to achieve the very thing that we long for as humans, which is acceptance and love, we pretend a lot. We wear these masks, we pretend, and we try to fit in different groups, as you talked about, myself exactly the same. And the irony of it all is that it's not until we share all of us, the good, the bad, and the ugly, will we actually be fully seen by ourselves and anyone else, and therefore have the opportunity to be fully accepted, fully seen, and fully loved. And the greatest example of this is, and I won't necessarily divulge too much here, but I just basically ran one last talk in a prison, and 6 men spoke. 4 had committed murder. 1 is serving murder. I can't really talk about his case. And the other one committed a sexual offense. And I had never imagined I'd be in that situation because of my own prejudice, my own judgments, and so on and so forth. But I learned a lot about being seen. I learned a lot about courage, and I learned a lot about forgiveness, acceptance, and healing in that room. And it's the place that I least imagined that I would experience that, in a prison with men who did things that society see as unacceptable, and they are unacceptable. And these men see them as unacceptable. But when you begin to understand their story, it doesn't justify the behavior. What it does is starts to give you insights into how their view of the world became as warped as it did for them to get to the point where they did what they did. And it doesn't make it okay. It just allows us to see what they did a little bit differently. That's all.
When you're having these talks, the last talk, like, what are you experiencing when you're watching this, something that you've created? Like, what are you feeling?
Me personally, it's been a really interesting experience and journey for me, and a bit of a test to some extent, because like a lot of people, I would say that, I would like to think that my ego doesn't get too much in the way, but the reality is my ego's there. So this was a real transition from me being the front of house guy, the onstage guy, and allowing other people to, number one, run it in different cities, and number two is allow the people, the stars, if you like, that's the wrong term, but to be the speakers and really allow them to shine. And I'll never forget, the very first event, it was different, but the second event, I remember thanking the speakers and thanking them for allowing me on their stage, and then standing to the side and giving them a standing ovation. And if anybody who's listening notices, when I run the event, I basically thank the speakers. They get a standing ovation typically, and the event's over. I don't need that recognition. So it's like I'm working with a couple of professional sports teams at the moment. It's a different energy. It's like working with your children to some extent, and then watching them succeed. It's creating a platform for allowing their brilliance and their beauty to shine, and playing a small role in that, being able to witness that is really magic. Mm-hmm. And I'm delighted to say that my ego is not as wrapped up in needing to be seen in those events, which is really immensely cool.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of like watching your kids, you talked earlier about fatherhood. There is a story that you were talking to Joe about on the podcast about your trip to Peru. I don't want to mess it up, but can you explain it, where you had your son draw a picture of what that day meant to him?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different stories there, but the one story that I remember that's coming to my mind right now is we went for dinner after working and spending. We didn't work. We spent time in an orphanage, holding hands, holding kids, playing with kids, playing soccer, the simplest of things, which is of course what they need. The owners and the organizations want new fridges and they want new roofs and everything else, but the kids just want to be engaged. And I think that's the missing piece. People don't realize that just by going down and spending time with them, that's what they really need. But I remember going to a restaurant one night and one particular trip and asking my son to draw what the day meant to him. And I'll never forget the drawing. He drew a soccer pitch in a field, and there was all these X's all over the soccer pitch. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Oh, that's all the cow shit, because in the little farm my wife is from in Ireland." And I said, "What are those? What's the goalposts?" "There are 2 jumpers, like hoodies. They're the jumpers." And I said, "So what's that got to do with your day in Peru?" He said, "Well, Dad, that was the other best day of my life, and today was the other one. And that's what I feel when I think about what I just experienced today." I'm not sure if that's the story you're referring to, But that is one story. And what that led to was just these amazingly simple insights into how my son is so different to my daughter and how they're so similar in so many ways. And I think a lot of us talk about gratitude, which is one way. And I think there's different ways to access gratitude. The 5 happiest days is a little exercise we do where people identify their 5 happiest days. And then the hierarchy of them 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, excuse me. In other words, the top one, the second one. Then you ask the question, why was that the happiest day? And then the job is to say, how can I create more of those experiences? Not the exact day, like a marriage or whatever necessarily, or a new baby or whatever, but it's how do I create more of those experiences? Because it's never the day, it's what the day represents. So that's the story.
I loved it, and I wanted you to talk about it because like I get lost in the madness of everyday life. I forget to come home. Like I'm always so worried and caught up with success and trying to create my own that I forget that my son, I've created this person, this human being that wants nothing more than my love, and not just him, but my daughters as well, and it made me realize it's just the simple things in life, the way that they communicate with us, and it was very powerful listening to that story because like I don't necessarily take the time to stop and ask him what he thinks. It's always like I'm always telling him things, right? I'm always telling him and explaining things to him about, and I don't want to push anything on him. Like I don't want to push my beliefs on him. I don't want to push my philosophy on life on him. I want him to just be and see it for himself. But I don't ever like, I mean, I shouldn't say I don't ever, but I tend to, be selfish in my needs first and don't really focus on what they need. And that story was like a reminder that I need to stop and I need to kind of take it in. Like it doesn't have to be a Peruvian trip. It can be just playing catch out in the backyard with a baseball. And
it doesn't.
And just having him explain, what that meant to him.
So I'm going to do something that I've never done before on any interview, but I'm going to read a post I put on Facebook literally yesterday, if you don't mind. And it's a photograph of my daughter, and we're on a plane. We're flying in on Monday evening from Canada, and my little girl is looking at the window, and I just sat there and I watched her, and I experienced overwhelming different emotions. And I then took a little snapshot of her and I put it on Facebook, and this is what I wrote. And I've never written anything like this before. It'll just take me a minute or two. I snapped this photograph last night before we landed. There is something about this experience, watching my little girl look out the window, that excites me and makes me sad at the same time. The only time I experience this, on the few occasions, I find myself seeing her look out the window of an aircraft, and I take the time to simply watch her. I imagine what goes through her mind as she looks down on the world. I imagine what she feels about herself in the world. I imagine what the world wants her to be and how she will navigate that. I briefly imagine leaving her at some point and my heart breaks. Then the question comes up for me. Am I really content with my role in her life? ? The answer is no. I want to spend more time with this angel. I want to take more risks with her. I want to be more present with her. I want to know her more. I want her to know me more. I want to be more patient with her. I want to challenge her more, and I want to accept her more. It's time to make some changes. Change is the only thing that changes anything.
That is beautiful. That's insane. Like that just hits home for me.
And the biggest thing in there, it was like I could feel the emotion like in my body when I think about like leaving her. Like I'm going to be gone, and she is I'm not going to be in her life. She's not going to be in my life. And people say, oh, that's such a stupid thing to think about. She's 7 years old. It's not a stupid thing to think about. The pain got me to realize, and it's not pain. It's not, that's the wrong term for it. It's just this emotional, unusual feeling that we desperately try to avoid. It informed the shit out of me. And basically what I said was the question I asked myself is, am I, in the end, it doesn't matter how I can sit here and justify I'm doing this for my kids and I'm building this business and I'm making a difference in the world and I'm doing this podcast. It doesn't matter, right? The question comes up is, the question here is, am I really content with my role in her life right now? And the answer to that question is no. And if it's no, here's the biggest mistake we make. What I'm really proud of myself on this post, and I rarely ever say that in my life, is that I didn't judge myself. I'm not beating myself up saying I'm not good enough, I'm not this. It's about understanding that I'm not necessarily happy with it and then being curious about how I can change it. But when I'm judging myself and there's judgment present, there's no growth. There's no possibility to grow. What you just do is keep doing the same thing. And for me, this is such an invitational thought. And now I can sit here and go, now, how can I change it? And how can I get it to a point where I am satisfied? And therefore, it doesn't lead me to have regrets about my daughter and my relationship with her in the future.
That's some powerful stuff. And thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to share something with you now because I'm not going to show judgment on myself. But I was literally Monday night baseball game with my son. Now, my son is very... he wants to be the class clown. He wants to stick out. He's probably not as athletic as I was, but I don't hold that against him. He's kind of interested in baseball, but it's not, Legos is his thing, reading comic books, Avengers, that sort of thing. So we're at the game. I'm sitting there by myself. My wife is working. I have the baby with me and I have my daughter, and it's probably the third inning, and he gets taken out of the game because he's like, I wouldn't say he's the worst player on the team, but he's like right there, right? And I shouldn't say the worst, but I mean, I shouldn't say worst. I should say that he is probably not as good at the game as most of the players. And I blame myself for not taking more time to work with him for the love of the game, for making him interested in the game. Because it's not like he can't do it physically. It's because he's not into it. And he's not into it because I'm not showing interest in it enough. Like, I am distracted with work and with other things, the podcast, business, whatever. And I'm not expressing to him my interest in him in the game. And the look on his face when he's sitting on the bench, it was cold out. It was kind of like he wanted to be in the game, but he was just like this look of disappointment, this look of, why am I not in the game? Why am I? And it's because that they had to put somebody better in the situation. And at that moment, I looked and I felt not disappointment in him, but disappointment in myself, because I wasn't taking the amount of time that it takes to develop a kid, into a sport or a situation in life and help them grow in that.
And then we could spin it the other way and say he's the number one player on the team, and he's on the team all the time, and deep down he hates the game. He's doing it to impress his dad, because his dad took all this time out of his work, took all this time from his podcasting, took all this time from his own personal interests, and obsessed about throwing the ball in the backyard, throwing the ball in the local park. So I'm not trying to say what's going on is not real, nor am I trying to dismiss it. But what I'm saying is that the most obnoxious but the greatest piece of parenting advice I will give anybody is, no matter what you do with your children, you're going to fuck them up. And what I mean by that is, and just before anybody judges me, maybe they've already judged me, just don't turn off the podcast until you hear this. Just one follow-up piece, please. And that is, when I realized that no matter what I do, if I hug my kids too much, they're going to be in therapy. If I don't hug them at all, they're going to be in therapy. And what I mean by that is, if you can understand that no matter what you do as a parent, it's never going to be fully enough, that your kids are going to have issues because of the way you treated them and the way you didn't. What that does is it allows me just a little bit more creative freedom, gives me a little bit of a break, takes the pressure off my back. It does not mean we give up on our kids. It just means that we let them go a little bit. We let them breathe. We let ourselves breathe. But that's one thing. The other thing is, I think what you said was, you kind of answered it. I think, and I say this very respectfully, it sounds like you're blaming yourself, and we don't have to get into this right now. But it sounds like your son doesn't even really want to play. It sounds like he's into comic books and other things. So it is such a, and again, if we turn the script, you could be having the same conversation with me right now about soccer or something else. So this is not me picking on you for sure. I just admire your courage today, and particularly on your own podcast is to me is such a huge insight, and your listeners are very lucky to have somebody that's courageous like you to listen into, because the world doesn't have enough of that. But listen, honestly, is that, and here's the thing is, are you having this conversation with your son? Is this the conversation you're having with your son, or do we have it today but your son doesn't get? I underestimate my children every single day in their capacity to understand and comprehend deeper emotional dialogue. And I just wonder what it would be like for you to have this conversation with your son. How old is he?
He just turned 9.
Yeah. And even if he can't fully comprehend all of it, it doesn't matter. Energetically, what he'll do is he'll feel heard and he'll feel seen. And if you allow him to see your emotion, he'll be able to see his dad in a space that's not weak, it's just called human. And what happens is a lot of us as parents don't allow our kids to see us cry. They don't allow us to see us in a vulnerable moment. They hear, oh, I'm sorry, son, but they don't hear, I'm so sorry, and I'm beating myself up for this, and that real sincere apology. And what we then do is we don't give them permission to feel inadequate and feel fear and to feel pain, because we're too busy trying to protect them, but really we're protecting ourselves. And the last thing I'll say, and this has nothing to do with you whatsoever, but I have found that parents live and parent from such a deep, selfish place. Now, bear with me for a second, and I use myself in this as well, is that we say things like, but I just want the best for my children. It's all about us. I want to make sure my kids don't experience the pain I did. That's all about you again. And people might say, well, hang on, I'm just trying to protect them. I know you are. But often you try to protect them to the detriment of who they are. In other words, you put soft, protective things on every piece of furniture in the house. So your kids can never get hurt physically, emotionally, and mentally. You never allow them to see you argue in front of them. You never once cry in front of them, because that you want to protect your kids and you want them to be strong. And then you die. You get hit by a bus. You get depressed, they leave and go to college, and then they have to wake up and walk into furniture and get hurt, and to get their hearts broken by a woman or a man, and they get fired from a job, and they get dropped by a friend, and they get crushed. And they don't know how to assimilate that into their bodies. They don't know how to process that pain. And what they do is they internalize and they feel like a piece of shit. They think it's their problem, but they can't reach out to you because you've been too busy being cool and Mr. Amazing Dad or Mom for the last 20, 30 years. So they can't reach out to you and be vulnerable. And yet that's what we want from all our kids. We want our kids to feel safe and share with us, yet we're not willing to share with them. I've got an Can I give a quick exercise for the audience?
Absolutely.
Pick one. Everybody's listening right now. Pick one relationship in this world. One relationship that you want to deepen the relationship with. Okay? So you have to pick that person. Now, do not avoid the person you don't think it's like, in other words, it's not possible. My dad has no interest. I've tried for 20 years. It's not possible, my dad. If you want to deepen your relationship with your father, pick your father. Pick the one that, even if you're angry at them, pick the one relationship you want to deepen. The next thing is, the question is, what do they need to do? Not you. What do they need to do in order to deepen the relationship that you have with them? What do they need to do? Not you. And people will say things like, well, hang on, that's obvious. I know it's my dad. I know what he needs to do, but he's no interest in doing it, or he hasn't demonstrated his ability to do it. Doesn't matter. Forget about that. So let's say it's my dad. And then you identify what is the thing he needs to do. And what he needs to do, maybe, for example, is he needs to be open with me and be more vulnerable with me. And then the question is this: do you do that with them? And if you're honest, the answer is absolutely no. And the answer, if you're honest, is you may think you do it, but you don't do it in a way that they can comprehend. So the very thing that we look, for example, well, I haven't talked to my sister for 20 years. What does she need to do? Say sorry. Well, how's that working for you? Well, it hasn't happened 20 years. And I've moved on from her. Well, it doesn't sound like you've moved on from her, because I can hear it in your voice. What would it be like if you said sorry to her? What would it be like if you picked, well, she doesn't deserve that. And I said, well, maybe you deserve that. Because when you say sorry to somebody else, when you forgive somebody else, it's a decent gift for them, but it's an extraordinary gift for you. It's an extraordinary gift for you. And the man who went to the hospital, I heard this story about 6 months ago, who went to the hospital to say goodbye to his father. And the doctor comes out and he says, it's time. And the young man said, my father's dying. And he said, not today, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day, but it's time to have the conversation. And the young man looks at the doctor and says, what conversation? And the doctor said, the conversation you probably should have had 20 years ago. There's so many of us that are avoiding the most important conversations in our lives. And the question I have is, what's the most important conversation you're simply not having today? And when we're lucky enough to be on our deathbed, when we have an opportunity to say goodbye, to say sorry, to say I love you, to say I have regrets, to say the things that we could have said 20 years ago, if we're lucky to get that opportunity, that's great. But that's far too long. That is way too long to wait.
Philip, this has probably been one of the most powerful episodes that I've had to this point. How do people connect with you? Well,
onelasttalk.com is a thing that is scares me the most and inspires me the most. It is not about me. It is much more important and bigger than Philip McKernan will ever be. We want that to grow. We want people to buy the book, irrespective whether you consider yourself a speaker. We want everyone to go through the process of the book, because you'll learn so much about who you are at your core. And the invitation at the end of the book is to deliver your one last talk to at least one other human being to make it powerful and to free yourself from it. Check out One Last Talk in terms of events. We're hoping to do one in Baltimore later this year. And then my own personal website is philipmckernan.com.
So to end this show, I've been thinking of a powerful way, and I can't think of any other powerful way to do it than this. But one last talk. Let's say this is your last mini speech to give your kids. What would you say to them right now?
Wow. I mean, I think it would be short and simple. I mean, I think in essence, it would be, I love you. Probably more than, I've ever been able to explain. I would like to say I'm sorry. And I would like to let them know that they are, without a shadow of a doubt, the greatest thing that has ever happened to me, irrespective of whether I've on occasion maybe not demonstrated that reality. And it's been an absolute blessing having them in my life, and I've been very fortunate.
It's beautiful. Philip, I want to say thank you for joining the show. It has been a true honor, and I know a lot of people are going to get a ton of value out of this conversation, and I just want to say thank you.
Well, I want to throw that. I thank you, first of all, and I'll accept some of that, but I want to throw half it back at you, because I do a lot of interviews, and I'm not suggesting they're not good or whatever, but I meet very few people who are willing to, be vulnerable and be courageous in their own, particularly in their own show. And that is an extraordinary, courageous, it's a privilege. It's an absolute privilege. So I want to say thank you for that.